very dramatic backdrop. The dragon
Well,
flying through the
yeah,
skies and whatever. Yes.
yeah, because this Saturday is the Chinese New Year. So,
The year of the dragon. Very
yes,
exciting.
yeah. So, since I don't see you before, I'll just happy Chinese New Year.
Happy Chinese New Year. Oh, indeed. Absolutely. Yes. Very
Yes.
exciting.
Yeah, and the Dragon's Year, we'll see what what is happening, right? There's so
Eh,
much going on.
Absolutely good. It is an auspicious year, I believe. So
Yeah, yeah,
auspicious for China.
yeah,
I firmly believe.
yeah. Okay. All right, let's start with China then. The Chinese economy. So I just yesterday I was talking to Garland Nixon about this, and
Mm.
the economy, as we were explaining, okay, it's a correction or something, and then I was just checking, it's the stock market is back, very very dramatically
Yeah.
back. What is your view? Is it just a correction, or is there something more to it?
It is a correction. I think the important thing to understand about China is that people who look at the Chinese economy um, compare it all the time to the US economy, and in some ways to the British economy. The US economy is basically a little like the British economy. They're both uh, the stock market, the financial world, all of that is very much part of the way in which the American economic system works. In China, it is not like that at all. Now, China is structured in a completely different way. Um, the most important part of the financial system in China is the banking system, which is unconnected to the stock market. So it's not the stock market that is responsible for investment, as in 19th century Germany. It is the stock market in China and the savings that people place in the banking system that provides the investment that keeps the economy moving. What goes on in the stock market, which goes up and down and moves about, is froth, if you like, on the sea, which is the Chinese economy. And it's a very deep sea. So people in the United States and in Britain who spend an enormous amount of time looking at the Chinese stock market, the Shanghai stock market, and are trying to understand what's going to happen to the Chinese economy, looking at those trends, are looking at completely the wrong thing. And that is not what you need to be looking at. What you need to look at is the stability of the banking system, the whether there's problems of the banking system, and to say it straightforwardly, there are not. Because, yes, there's been problems in the property markets, the real estate issues in China. We've been hearing an awful lot about that. That's probably, by the way, over its peak now. Anyway, um, there are always businesses and companies in China, as in every important economy, which have their ups and downs. But China still has a colossal savings rate
Mhm,
that keeps the banking system strong
mhm,
and it enables the economy to grow. And the most important thing, and the thing that people always get wrong about China, is that the most important thing to look at, in my opinion, still is manufacturing. Manufacturing in China expanded in 2023. All the evidence is it's continued to expand despite all the things that you've been hearing about how the Inflation Reduction Act is leading to manufacturing and industrial boom in the United States. Manufacturing production in the United States in 2023 actually declined. It declined month after month after month, even as in China it grew. So those are the real statistics. Those are the real figures. And the fact that the stock market goes up and down, it doesn't mean as much in China. It's people who are putting in money in the stock market, looking to make money fast. Sometimes when it works like that, they do make money very fast, and sometimes people take out all the money very quickly, and well, they lose their money that way, and it's bad for them or good for them. But in the great ocean that is the Chinese economy, it doesn't mean that much.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's different because most Chinese companies, it doesn't rely so heavily on the stock market for fundraising, right? Either. So that's also different. Yeah.
They are also able, and they do this to a much greater extent than you see in the United States, and especially in Britain. In Britain, it's a disastrous situation. They are able to reinvest from their profits. They continue to be very profitable, and they use their profits for reinvestment. Now, that also keeps the economy in general stable. And again, this is very different from what we have in the West. In Britain, which I know better than the United States, but in the United States, it's very, very similar. Profits tend to find their way to shareholders through dividends, and are not, reinvested in the business of the company itself.
Yeah. And then also recently in China, there's a lot of discussion about the CPTPP. I want to hear your view on that. So CPTPP stands for Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It started by, I believe, Barack Obama trying to isolate China, I guess. And is that the purpose? And then U.S. after Donald Trump become president, so U.S. left. So then China applied, like China is interested, but then now I think it's got rejected or something. They're trying to get in, but didn't. And so there's a lot of discussion. I personally never liked it, CPTPP. I think it seems like a limit the power of the government. It's one of the things it does is to set up their own court, the dispute. So if a company violating some country's rule, you can go to that court, and if that court decided you haven't, violated any rule, actually that decision overrides the government. So just that alone, I find that's part of the reason Donald Trump left, and many people don't like that for that reason. A lot of even the environmental groups, even the unions, they don't like the CPTPP. So what
It's
is
a
the
very
idea? But what's
Yeah,
the
I mean,
idea of this whole thing?
you're absolutely correct. It was a geopolitical project launched by the Obama administration in order to try to isolate China and to win over the Pacific states to to win them back to the US. I mean, this whole period of rivalry with China really took off in a big way during the Obama administration. Again, people don't always understand this. I mean, because Obama was always very careful to, to avoid using too strong language and to conceal his tracks, if you like. But it was in Obama's time that the United States began to deceive China as its major geopolitical rival. So they were worried about the fact that a lot of the Pacific states were developing friendly relations with China and very strong economic relations with China, just as they were starting to worry that some European states like Germany were starting to forge strong economic relations with Russia. In the Pacific, of course, it's even more serious. It's, a matter of huge concern. So they started to they look for ways to win these countries back from China. And they created this partnership whose purpose was to basically win them over to the United States by doing that which the United States has been doing, by the way, continuously since the start of the Cold War in the 1940s, 50s, which is opening its markets to the countries that it wants to make friends with. So the idea is you sell the goods to the United States, you become in that way entangled in the US economy, and that way you consolidate your alliance with them. That's what happened with the Europeans in the 1950s, and it's what they were trying to do with the Asians, the Indo-Asian, the Indo-Pacific Asian states against China. Now, it didn't really work because the one consequence of this is, of course, it means that cheap goods from these countries enter the United States, and that goes against the desire of some people in the United States to develop domestic industries and to protect blue collar working class jobs. And especially Donald Trump, who before 2016 was making a big pitch to win over working class votes. He said that he wouldn't join this thing and he'd pull out of it. And he did. And then, of course, the Chinese said, well, if the Americans are pulling out, this is our chance. Let's go in and let's see whether we can turn it round to our own advantage. And that hasn't really worked out very well either. I am like you. I don't think these projects are a good thing at all. And, you set up these courts, and the problem with doing that is that originally they are supposed to be arbitration courts, basically to resolve trade disputes. And then the Americans in particular are very skilled at building them up, developing them into something much more than that. And then they become a tool to interfere in the domestic policies of your own country. And I think some people in China are beginning to figure that out, or have figured that out, and have decided we don't really want to be involved in this either. Of course, the great irony is that the United States itself, even as it encourages countries to join up with these systems and to observe the rules of the courts, it always says that it itself is not subject to these rules. I mean, they said this about court. I mean, the ICC, they've even the International Criminal Court. They'll even said that if this court issues any indictments against American officials for war crimes or human rights violations, they reserve the right to arrest the officials of the court and bring them to the United States and try them there. So that's the rules-based international order. You see, you have all of these elaborate systems and courts and things, and they are supposed to make decisions which are unfriendly to countries that that the United States is unfriendly towards. But of course, the United States hovers above this because, of course, it's the great rules maker, and it can't be subject to any rules itself. So I think the Chinese should be much better advised staying out of it. I mean, it's an anti-Chinese project to start with, and why would China want to be involved in it? That's my own view.
Yeah, I agree. I think this kind of thing, if you're serious to have some kind of a trade organization, you should welcome everybody and just take out the trade barrier and stuff like that. Don't make it so political. Or we're building this to against this country, that country. That just never. I mean, to me, it's just.
Well, it never works. And of course, we have the World Trade Organization, which of course it has the last time I looked, which admittedly was a while back, its arbitration court doesn't work. It hasn't been set up because, of course, the United States isn't happy with the kind of decisions it's made in the past. So it's not allowing it basically to pick judges so that it could constitute itself as a court, which is why it's essentially blocked. Now, that might have changed. That was some time ago. I don't think it has, by the way. I mean, I haven't heard that it has. But there is already the World Trade Organization. So why reinvent the wheel with all these other systems? I mean, it doesn't make much sense to me.
Okay, about the Wang Yi and the Jake Sullivan's meeting in Bangkok. That got lots of attention, but based on the readout, I don't feel like they achieved much concrete other than they both agree Xi Jinping and Joe Biden is going to have some kind of phone meeting or teleconference, something that seems like they agreed. Other than that, I think both readout was like, okay, it's a candid discussion, which means they probably have things they disagree. I don't know if that's how you read it. And so what is your comment on that?
I completely agree with that. I mean, we have these meetings between Wang Yi and Jake Sullivan and Chinese officials and other American officials. And it's quite clear to me that the two sides are coming to these meetings with completely different agendas and completely different understandings of the way forward. The Chinese want to develop strong, stable, practical relationship with the United States. I mean, they say to themselves, if we have a good relationship with the United States, we can trade with them, they can trade with us. The situation is stable. We agree the rules. It's a win-win. I mean, this is the comment that you always see the Chinese make. We're looking for win-win relations. The United States sees things in a completely different way. They basically use these meetings um, to try to string China along
Mhm.
so that on the one hand, they can pretend that there's a kind of normality in relations so that things don't get completely out of control. But at the same time, it is not going to stop the United States taking whatever steps it considers it needs to take in order to contain China. So it's an attempt basically to normalize containment of China by the United States. And this is unacceptable to the Chinese. And when you read in a readout about candid talks, that tells you that there's not only been strong disagreements, major disagreements, but that these have been very, very frankly expressed. And the people who are expressing these disagreements very frankly are the Chinese. The Chinese don't want to see a crisis in the Pacific, but they are, and they've been making this very clear now for some time, they are becoming increasingly concerned about the direction of American policy. And they will continue with these meetings because why wouldn't they? Why? I mean, it's the Americans who believe in not talking to your adversary, not China. They will continue with these meetings. But of course, China is noting the steps that the United States is taking, and it is taking counter steps.
Yeah. And follow that, Jake Sullivan also gave a speech at the, I believe it's called the Council for Foreign Affairs. It's one of those foreign policy think tanks. And it's, again, got lots of attention. What's interesting in that speech was he basically said that the effort to trying to change China failed. So he openly admit that the U.S. has been trying to change China. Okay, so that's interesting. But then if you listen to him, it's like oh, the relationship, their meeting is, even though they're disagreement, but they seems to doing they're still improving. Kind of like there's a softening or warming a little bit. At the same time, but right now there are three aircraft carriers in the Asia Pacific. So I think it's called USS Ronald Reagan, are supposed to go home and then being replaced by Ford, USS Ford. But Reagan doesn't seem leaving. So there are three aircraft carriers right now in Asia Pacific. Now, some people are saying, the Chinese media is saying maybe because this is election year, so Biden wants to show the people, his critics, that I'm not just focusing on Ukraine. I haven't forgot China. It could be for show, but it could be for real. But in any event, China take it seriously. So China is on high alert for that. So
Oh,
you on the one side talking and saying, okay, we're warming up and we're trying to improve the relationship, and then here you have three aircraft carriers there. So
indeed. So, I mean, let's come back to this business about, changing China, that the effort to change China failed. One should not, um, one should not become, accept this kind of language uh, uh, because the Americans talk like this all the time, and people in the West and Europe now are increasingly talking like this all the time. One shouldn't come to accept it and regard this kind of language as acceptable. It is not the business of the United States to change China in any particular direction. The only people who are entitled to change China are the Chinese people, not the American government and its friends. I mean, that whole concept is fundamentally wrong. It is, as we would say in Britain, an imperialistic one, because it is, because that's how the British, by the way, always justified their empire. That, you go around the world and you conquer all these countries, and you're going to change these countries and you're going to make them better according to your lights. And of course, what generally happened was the opposite, because you made them better in your interests, not theirs. And it was the Chinese would say, I think, that this is hegemonic thinking, because that's exactly what it is. It is hegemonic thinking by the United States. And when Jake Sullivan talks like that, and talks like that about China, and speaks with a tone of regret that the attempt to change China has failed, what he is showing is that he's still a prisoner of hegemonic thinking. That is basically what he wants to achieve, and that he's signaling to an American audience that the fact that we failed to change China means that China is resisting us and is therefore an adversary. It has to be understood in that way. It's the kind of comment that ultimately explains why Chinese US relations cannot be stable. Because so long as the United States thinks like this about China, by definition, they cannot be. And then the one thing leads to the other. Because if you think of China as an adversary, that is why you have those 3 aircraft carriers cruising around the Pacific, doing nothing else ultimately but threatening China, because what else are they doing in the Pacific apart from that? Now, I don't think it's anything to do with the election yet, because I don't think the American public wants a war with China. I mean, I don't think people in the United States generally want a war. There's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States, which has been built up now over a period of about 10 years, going all the way back to the Obama administration and beyond. But I don't think that the fact that there are these 3 aircraft carriers is much talked about in the United States, because the United States, the government of the United States, knows that whatever their feelings about China, the American people do not want to get involved, be drawn into another war, this time against China. So they are not about the election. They are about putting pressure, keeping the pressure on China. And in fact, I've been reading reports that there's a major dispute underway within the Pentagon, that of some officials in the Pentagon, CENTCOM, as it's called, the military command that's responsible for the Middle East, wants to keep as many troops and missiles and ships, warships in the Middle East to confront Iran. And the military command that's responsible for the Indo-Pacific is very angry about this, because they want to transfer this equipment to the Pacific region, because they are focused now on confronting and, as they would say, containing China. So this is not an election gimmick. It is a reflection of the strategic priorities, not just of the Biden administration, but of the United States and of its permanent government.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking that during the Obama year, what he also tried was the G2. Remember, for a while they talked about the G2. Now in China, in the end, China didn't go along with it. In China, the interpretation of that is, okay, that means, okay, now we are brothers, we're so close. That means what is yours is mine. What is mine is still mine. So that's the idea of the G2. So that's why. And after that, Obama did this TPP thing. And one more thing is the things we're talking about Chinese New Year. Actually, before Obama, if the president, any U.S. president, if they say Happy Chinese New Year, they would say Happy Chinese New Year. It is Obama who changed that into Happy Lunar New Year. You see, Lunar New Year, Chinese New Year is not the same thing. The Arab countries using the lunar calendar, that's not the same as the Chinese New Year calendar. It's not the same thing. But he's the one who makes it. He doesn't say the Chinese New Year anymore, even though he was using the time, it's the Chinese New Year, but he's saying
Well,
Happy
there you
Lunar.
go. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't know that, but there we go. I mean, I think that's exactly that's very typical of Obama, by the way. You have to always follow. I mean, he was somebody you needed to read very carefully what he said, and always there were double meanings and all kinds of meanings squirreled into every phrase. He was a lawyer. He is a consummate lawyer, and I always found it exhausting trying to pass his speeches, to go through his speeches, because almost every sentence, when you read it carefully, meant the opposite of what it was intended, what it appeared to mean. And this is just another example. So he says, "Happy Lunar New Year." And in fact, it's not friendly towards China at all, as it might be taken by some people to be. It's the opposite, and that is a bummer for you. And the G2, you're absolutely correct. I mean, it was not really about getting into a good partnership, a close, friendly partnership with China. It was all about ultimately the United States getting China to help the United States, so that the United States could preserve its position in every conceivable way, including where Chinese interests were concerned.
I have to say that lots of times the relationship with the US, I find the US is very abusive, towards, for example, with the Germany. I find it's a very abusive relationship. Do you agree?
Oh yes, it is absolutely so, but the United States assumes that it has the right to be abusive. It's got this very strange conception of itself, that it is the exceptional country and that it knows better and sees further, and every other country must bend to its will, and somehow what the American will is ultimately, best for the progress of humanity, because that is the progress of humanity is identical to the progress and interests of the United States. It's a very, very deeply entrenched view amongst Americans. A friend of mine who knows the United States better than I do says that it originates from Protestantism, a certain type of Protestantism, which believes in the doctrine of the elect, the chosen of God, and that this is Calvinist. It's a Calvinist view, and that the United States has internalized that it was the sort of doctrine of the Pilgrim Fathers and the people in the Massachusetts who set up, who founded many of the original colonies. They believed themselves to be the virtuous Christian people who were setting up the virtuous Christian state, and that the United States has somehow taken that into its DNA. Well, that's perhaps a bit too deep and psychological for me, but you can see, you can see nonetheless that the United States does come to everything with this colossal sense of entitlement, and it's been able to do so until recently, because it has been so powerful relative to every other country it's ever had to deal with. Now that it's got China, which is potentially, which is actually as powerful as itself, it finds it very, very frustrating and very baffling. And it's one reason why the Americans are both so antagonistic towards China, but at the same time so nervous of it.
Yeah, talking about, relationship, the Middle East, right? So, what is going on there? It's just so, I can't keep up. So on the one hand, now US is now bombing Iraq and Syria, right? Supposedly retaliation against Iran, but they're bombing Iraq and Syria. And then there were rumors saying that there is a ceasefire deal. It's supposed to come last Saturday. Clearly didn't. I thought the US promised Israel to bomb Iran, and in exchange that Netanyahu will agree to a ceasefire. But that clearly didn't happen. Now, some people saying the ceasefire is still possible, still coming, but others saying, no, you just, thinking too much. It's not going to happen. In the meantime, Turkey now launched airstrikes against the Kurdish militants, also in Iraq and Syria. Yeah. So all this, can you sort this through to me? What is going on?
It is a drift towards a war. And I think we have to see through the diplomatic fog that is being created, because there is a lot of diplomatic fog being created, not always intentionally, by the way. The epicenter of this crisis remains the conflict in Gaza. the United States, the Biden administration back in October gave Israel a completely open check to do what it wanted in Gaza. The Israelis went into Gaza just intent on destroying Hamas. Some people in Israel wanted to go much further than that. When I say some people in Israel, I should make it clear some people in the Israeli government, the actual cabinet, wanted to go much further than that. They wanted to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza and settle it with Israelis. Now they're saying this openly, by the way. And what happened was that Israel found, and the United States found, that the conflict, the war in Gaza, is proving much more difficult than they expected. They expected it would be over within a few weeks. It's dragged on for months. They failed to find a successful outcome to it. So, because the war in Gaza is continuing and Israel is proving unsuccessful, and it's important to say that if Israel cannot defeat Hamas in Gaza, Hamas effectively has won. All that Hamas needs to do is to survive in order to win. What Israel has to do is to destroy Hamas in order to win, and it hasn't been able to do that. No less a person than Mao Zedong, by the way, who knew an awful lot more about guerrilla wars and insurgencies, and that kind of conflict, than anybody in the United States or Israel appears to do. He explained all this extremely well. Just saying. So that conflict in Gaza hasn't been going well. The United States has this huge fleet patrolling around the waters of the Middle East. This has been a standing temptation for some people in Washington to use. They're able to say that because the conflict in Gaza is unresolved, we have to find some way to achieve a victory, because if we don't achieve a victory in Gaza, what we're seeing is the entire international position of the United States deteriorate in the Middle East, because Arab opinion is becoming increasingly hostile to us. So some of these people say we must therefore launch attacks against anti-American actors across the Middle East, and ultimately against the country which we say controls them, which is Iran. So that's one side of the American government. The other side says we are tied up in Ukraine. We want to have this conflict with China. And it's important, by the way, to stress that when I talk about these people who I'm going to discuss now, they're not moderates. They are simply people who understand that there are limits to how many wars the United States can fight in one place. And most of them are driven more by hostility to China at the moment than they are driven by hostility to Iran. Anyway, these people are saying we can't continue to involve ourselves in a conflict in the Middle East because we need to refocus on China and we need to pull troops out of the Middle East. So we've had these two different factions, one based more in the Pentagon, the one that wants to focus more on China, the other perhaps focused on in the National Security Council, which wants to focus more on the Middle East. And sometimes the balance tilts towards the one, sometimes it tilts towards the other. And in a situation which is already inherently unstable because this fighting in Gaza is continuing, sometimes the hardliners win out. And, you know, there's an attack on an American base, there's missile strikes on American ship, on commercial ships, all connected to the fact that this war in Gaza is taking place and people in the Middle East are becoming more and more angry. So the hardliners then use all of that to try to push the envelope, to start fighting and bombing across the Middle East with the eventual intention of going after Iran. Whilst at the same time, the other group who don't want the United States to become too involved in the Middle East look for some kind of diplomatic outcome. And of course, they've been trying to broker a ceasefire in Gaza, only a ceasefire very much on American Israeli terms, and one which would be temporary, relatively short. They want to dial everything down. Um, they also try to limit the extent of the strikes. So they don't want a war against Iran. So, as you correctly say, a warning against Iran means that Iraqis and Syrians get killed instead. it's
Yeah, yeah.
There's no real logic to this, but I mean that's what they try and do. And what happens is policy is never able to really coalesce in any clear direction. So they've been bombing now for about a week. Nobody can see that this bombing is having any effect. It's not achieving any American objectives. It's making the attempts to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza actually more difficult. Hamas has come out and said that the terms of the ceasefire that are being proposed are unacceptable. They want a much longer ceasefire and one which involves the pullout of Israeli troops. Israel cannot afford a ceasefire on these terms because if there is a ceasefire on those sort of terms, Hamas has won. So ultimately, all of these diplomatic moves mean nothing. What really matters is the fact that we see a conflict in the Middle East and it is spreading with Americans bombing in all sorts of places, with various other countries now becoming increasingly concerned. Turkey, as you rightly say, is starting to bomb the Kurds in Syria, who are, of course, America's allies and Israel's allies also, by the way. Iran is preparing to take is preparing its defenses, and today Saudi Arabia, which has historically been America's most important ally in the Middle East, but which is nonetheless a Muslim and Arab country, has now issued an absolute scorcher of a statement. I mean, a very, very strong statement, unusually strong, coming from the Saudis, who usually are very careful in the way that they express themselves. They usually use very restrained language, not in this statement, in which they said that under no circumstances will they establish diplomatic relations with the Middle East unless there is a full and complete ceasefire in Gaza, the Israeli troops pull out of Gaza, a Palestinian state is created, and East Jerusalem is its capital, all of which, of course, is unacceptable to Israel. So the battle lines are being drawn in the Middle East, and despite all this diplomatic fog that you are hearing, we are steadily and inexorably moving towards an all-out war because the US diplomacy is contradicted by its own actions. And the US itself can't decide which policy in the end it should follow. Either a policy seeking peace in the Middle East, which would require it to take one set of steps, or an alternative policy, which is a policy of war, which inevitably must mean war with Iran. So we are heading slowly, very gradually towards a war. And that is why the situation in the Middle East is deteriorating.
Yeah, it's it's interesting. The Chat GPT, there is a Chinese version Chat GPT, and I saw some people are posting videos when you ask the Chinese Chat GPT, when will the World War III start? And the Chinese version says it already started. Now the English one I asked, it says, "Oh, I cannot predict the future." But the Chinese one, I don't know whether that's somebody, just making a fun movie or something. It's just I find that's interesting. It's might already started. We don't know.
Well, in a kind of a way, you can say that it. I mean, I don't think World War III is exactly where we're going, but a period of very acute geopolitical conflict, more acute than we've seen. Now, if you look at the two world wars, in both cases, there were conflicts which happened, which were clearly precursors to the major conflict that took place. So, firstly, there was if we're talking about the First World War, there were a series of wars in the Balkans between Serbia, Greece, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Romania, all of these countries, they were all involved fighting each other at various times. And these started from about 1910 and they continued right up until 1914. And the First World War, essentially, it didn't exactly grow out of these wars, but it's now clear that the First World War was to some extent signaled by the fact that these conflicts were taking place. The fact that these conflicts were taking place was a sign that there was a breakdown in relations between the great powers and that their proxies were fighting each other. And then you had the same thing in the period leading up to the Second World War. So you had a conflict in Ethiopia when Italy invaded Ethiopia. You had a conflict in Spain, which was to some extent a dress rehearsal for the war in Europe. And then in 1931, in Manchuria, you had a major incident between Japan and China. And then, of course, the war, the Second World War, actually began in 1937 when there was the war between Japan and China. And then gradually that war spread to Europe, and we had the war in Europe in 1939, and then the Soviet Union, first the Soviet Union, and then the United States became involved in 1941. But you could see that before a major conflict starts, when there's tensions in this international system, it starts to find its reflections and its rehearsals, if you like, in various other places. I think because of nuclear weapons and the sheer might of the great powers nowadays, we're not going to see a world war. I think even in the United States, people do understand how dangerous that would be. But if nuclear weapons did not exist, if the situation, the balance between the great powers was not as it is, then it's all of these conflicts could be seen as precursors to a world war, and we might potentially be in exactly that kind of dangerous position.
And this Operation Prosperity Guardian, do you think, I feel like it's just falling apart. It never was that big of a thing from the beginning, right? There's very lukewarm interest from the European countries. And now, like both France and Spain, Italy, they are now officially withdraw. And
Yeah, and
it was not much, but at the same time, they cannot just leave, right? That would be too embarrassing, is it?
no, this is exactly correct. I mean, it's been a failure. It was a failure right from the outset because it was never going to achieve its objective. And now, by the way, Britain is pulling out its major warship because it can't work. So, I mean, it doesn't work. So, I mean, which of course leaves the whole thing looking increasingly like just the United States on its own. It was completely ill-conceived strategy because, again, it's it's the wrong solution. What the Americans are trying to do is that they're trying to find a military solution to a political problem. The political problem is the conflict, not just in Gaza, but in the Palestinian territories. But they are unable somehow to deal with that problem. So instead, they're carrying out these performative military acts, which in fact end up putting them in a more disadvantageous position.
Okay, let's turn to Europe.
Mm.
So what is going on with all the farmers' protest, right? It's now spreading, I believe, Britain also. I mean, it
Yeah.
started in the Holland and then gradually Germany, Belgium, everywhere. Poland, I
Mm,
think, Romania. I mean, it's now everywhere.
mm,
So
mm,
my understanding, one of the many issues is this green policy that really crippled many farmers, right? So they simply couldn't afford all this, and then subsidy is gone and those sort of things. Why are those European governments so harsh on their farmers? I thought farmers producing food, right? They should be get subsidies and this help and that help. Instead, they are so so headstrong to put on all these very restrictive rules and this and that, really to hurt the farmers? What are they doing? Why are they doing that?
Well, why are they doing it? I mean, I think the first thing to say is that um, um, not just European governments, but Western governments in general are showing an astonishing complacency about their agricultural, the agricultural part of their economies, their farming economies. It is really astonishing. But I was somebody who grew up with the legend of the mighty American farm industry, that was producing food in these colossal volumes, and supplied wheat and
Mhm.
food products to the world. And in fact, now I understand that the average age of a farmer in the United States is well into the mid 60s. I mean, it's something that only old people do. Young people don't want to do it anymore. It nowhere in any part of the West is it very profitable any longer. It's certainly not profitable in Britain, and it is becoming increasingly unprofitable in Europe. And I can't help but think that, in a kind of a way, it's partly because if you look at the political class right across the West, they are not people who come from the productive, who have any real understanding or connection to the productive side of the economy. They're not engineers, they're not agronomists, they're not any of these things. And fundamentally, they have no connection to farmers or manufacturers or engineering or any of these things. Now, why specifically about farming? Well, green policies are playing a key role in Europe and indeed in Britain, in the sense that the way they function is very, very inimical to farming principles. There's also been an increasing amount of concentration in the food distribution industry, which means that farmers have to deal with monopolies, that big retail monopolies that control food supply, and that has had a downward push on food prices. Well, of course, looming over everything, the great subject no one ever wants to talk about is the crisis in Ukraine. And you can't really separate this, because what the crisis in Ukraine has done is, on the one hand, it's increased the cost of fuel and energy, especially diesel oil. And bear in mind, green politicians in Europe don't like diesel. I mean, they have a particular hostility to diesel. So that is difficult for the farmers, who need fuel, obviously, to keep their tractors running. And by the way, they need the byproducts of the oil and gas industry, especially the gas industry, for fertilizer. So they are facing problems with fertilizer costs. Fertilizer, the major exporter of fertilizer, not just to Europe, but to most of the world, by the way, was Russia. So, of
Mhm.
course, we can't buy their fertilizer. So that's already creating a whole set of other problems. And on top of that, there is now the overriding geopolitical imperative, which is to support Ukraine. And of course, the only thing Ukraine can export is grain, which, by the way, is grown in Ukraine. The people who export the grain from Ukraine are, in fact, big American agricultural complexes. We're not talking about, small farmers in Ukraine, tilling the land or anything like that. But anyway, they are transferring grain from Ukraine, and of course, much of it is passing through Europe, and it is being dumped there. And that's having another downward effect on prices. So it is destroying the European farm industry and, of course, the livelihood of the farmers who work in that industry. But the European political class has little understanding of this and fundamentally no sympathy in it.
I find that's spectacular. I mean, how can they just so out of touch, right? That people
Yeah.
are so angry on the street for so long, but they don't seem touched by it. It's just so remarkable in my view.
Well, they're not touched by it because it doesn't affect them. I mean, this is the fundamental problem. I mean, this is where we come back to the ultimate underlying fallacy about, the West being these great pluralistic societies and China being this authoritarian one-party state. The Chinese government could not conduct the kind of policies that Europeans do, because there are mechanisms of accountability in China which simply don't exist any longer in the West. In the West, we have traditionally achieved accountability through multi-party systems. If somebody does something wrong and does something unpopular, you vote for someone else. If all the parties agree with each other and agree on the same set of objectives, then of course accountability disappears, because you vote for one and you get the same result as you would if you voted for the other. And with all of these extraordinary structures that have been created on top of the national politics that used to exist in European countries. And remember, the European Union is just the most important example, but it is far from being the only one. I mean, the West is now, there's the spread of these supranational bureaucracies. Well, it's the supranational bureaucracies where many of the key decisions now are made, and they're not subject to electoral challenge at all, because the people who work in them are appointed and not elected. Farm policy in the European Union specifically being the key case in point. I mean, it's run through the so-called common agricultural policy. So it means that there is no responsibility and no accountability, and that gives the European political class and the British political class, and to a certain extent the American political class, enormous freedom to indulge in whatever particular agendas they might have. And if 100,000 people protest outside, well, it doesn't really affect them, because they can call these people populists and demagogues and use all these rude words about them. But those people out there, they can only protest. They can't actually get their hands on the levers of power, because they're excluded from them, much more so than, as I said, you would find in a country like China, where, to say it straightforwardly, if people got in trouble, if these kind of policies happened in China, there'd be all kinds of mechanisms that would immediately come into play, which would act as a corrective. I've seen this.
Yeah, they actually pay a lot of attention to what people are saying. I mean,
Yeah.
part of the things that the internet has been used actually by the government is they watch what people are talking
Yeah.
about, or what people are upset about. They actually do pay attention to the online discussions. So which
When
actually
I
should be the
should be,
way. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
When I went to China in 2017, the person who invited me there was a banker, a Western banker, by the way, not a Chinese banker. But he told me an awful lot about the kind of company articles the big companies have in China, the constitutions, and again how mechanisms of consultation aimed to preserve social stability are embedded in corporate structures, which is completely different from anything that you see in the West.
And in fact, when they have new policies that they know could be controversial, they would throw it out there to just tell people, okay, we're discussing this policy. And they actually want people to have discussions online. They actually do to get a feeling, okay, will this be accepted? Because for a while there were discussions about the gay marriage, legalized gay marriage. And they know that China is still very conservative in this aspect, very conservative. So they just throw it out there, let people discuss. What's interesting was, and clearly, and then surely enough, so lots of people immediately jumped on the comment section and saying no. So overwhelmingly, people against it. What's interesting to me was the reason they're against it is not thinking, okay, there's a religious reason, there's this reason. Actually, the main reason lots of people are saying, well, then you will allow like gay couples to have children. How can gay couple have children? Well, then you need surrogates, and surrogates is illegal in China because people see that as rich people paying poor girls to carry their kids. That's exploration. That's it's just not very. So lots of people have problem with that. So so they're against the gay marriage for that reason. That what's the point having a marriage if you don't have kids? Of course, you want to have children. Well, then how can gay couple have children, right? So so that's how lots of people against it. I find that's interesting.
No, it's most interesting. It's most interesting at multiple levels. I remember when we got gay marriage here in Britain. I mean, it wasn't widely discussed at all. It was just agreed within the political class, and a vote went through the parliament, and any MP in the British Parliament who voted against it was, in serious trouble. I mean, all the others would sort of, we don't even talk with him. He's a bigot or whatever it was. And the word exploitation, which used to be used so much by the left in Europe, 50, 60, 70 years ago. I haven't heard that word used in political or social discussions for a very, very long time. It's one of those taboo words which we just don't use anymore.
Yeah,
a few Marxists, a few old Marxists might still use it, but in the universities, but no one else does. You won't see it anywhere. I can definitely say this in British or American media now.
Yeah. And actually, when I think about it, it's correct, right? The surrogate is, because carrying children is a lot of risks, right? And so why would anybody, if not for money, why would anybody do that for other people, right? And so,
of course, it's correct. It's absolutely correct. It is a case, absolutely. And again, one doesn't have to be a Marxist to see this. The Marxists are people who are very conscious of these things. But of course, it is a case of the fact that some people are poor, being used by people who are rich in order to achieve the objectives and the desires of the people who are rich. That is exploitation. But as I said, we don't use that term.
Yeah, and that's eventually that. So they didn't go through with that because they see there's too much blowback, and that was it. And of course the Western saying, China is so backwards and do not approve, gay marriage. But actually, there's more to it. I mean, it's not that simple.
No, it isn't. It isn't that simple at all. It would not have been possible for China to achieve what it has achieved had it been as the kind of monolithic, one, everything decided at the top and implemented from the bottom that people in the West imagine.
Yeah. Okay, Ukraine. So now, before we get to detail in Ukraine, so U.S. is planning to station nuclear weapons in UK. Is that serious? And the Russian said it's going to respond. So this is just talk, or is this serious?
No, I think it's completely serious. I think this is absolutely coming, actually. And I think that it is only a matter of time before the United States brings nuclear weapons back to Germany and perhaps the Netherlands as well, where, of course, they were based during the Cold War. I mean, we're seeing a complete return to the military structures of the Cold War. We had nuclear weapons in Britain throughout the Cold War, American nuclear weapons in Britain throughout the Cold War, and now we're seeing them come back.
And nobody seems to even discuss about that. I think it's pretty serious.
Well, it is astonishing. I mean, again, I speak for much of my adult life, the part of it which I lived through the Cold War. There was enormous opposition in Britain and Germany and the Netherlands to the presence of American nuclear weapons on the territories of these countries. There was a huge anti-nuclear weapons movement in Britain called the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And of course, the Green Party in Germany originated, more than anything else, as an anti-nuclear weapons movement, and was propelled into political prominence as a result of its opposition to the deployment of Pershing and cruise missiles by the United States, nuclear tipped missiles by the United States in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And I can remember the huge protests that were organized at that time. All of that has ended. And the Green Party in Germany would probably welcome the weapons if they were ever proposed. And I suspect the same would be true of Britain today.
About Ukraine, okay, I find it's fascinating what's going on in the U.S. about this $60 billion, right? So the last was that there was a package for Israel, a package to aid Israel. It's 17 billion or something, 17.6, and it failed. And the reason it failed is because a lot of Democrats saying, okay, you don't put the 60 billion to support Ukraine together. So we voted, if it's separated, we vote against it. So that's the reason it failed. I find it's actually incredible that the Biden and the Democrat are really pick up this fight, because they tried to do that in using the border issue, right? That would in the whole thing, the whole drama in the Texas was part of that too. That Biden want to use, trying to force everybody to pass this so-called border act or whatever. It's actually not a border bill. It's it's about Ukraine, but. And that failed, and now they're trying this one. And then Chuck Schumer even said something like, if we don't give the money, well, then U.S. troops might need to go to Ukraine, something like that. This now become an epic battle, seems to me. Isn't that
I know. It is amazing. And it's all to do with domestic American politics, in my opinion. I think it's anything to do with Ukraine. I don't think most of the people who are involved in this conflict care about Ukraine at all. As far as the Republicans are concerned, if Ukraine goes down in smoke, it's the Biden administration's problem. And, that's fine by them going into the election. And as far as the Democrats are concerned, if Ukraine goes down, well, the most important thing is to blame that on the Republicans, to make sure the blame attaches to the Republicans rather than that any of it attached to them. So I think that's really what we're looking at now. But I think the overriding issue is the election in November. The Republicans have decided that they're going to use the subject of illegal immigration as the main issue, one of the main issues that they're going to use in the election against Biden and against the Democrats. And I think they've realized that they are onto a vote winner here. Maybe they're overestimating that, but that's, I think, what they believe. And from their point of view, if you think of it in that way, if this is going to be one of your major strategies, then you don't want a negotiated solution to the problem of the border, especially a solution to the problem of the border, which might in the end turn out to be less than a complete solution, because you want to keep thousands of migrants crossing the border, because then you could tell people, well, the only way to stop the migrants crossing the border is to vote us in, to give us the White House and Congress so that we can pass legislation to stop it. I mean, I think this is all that is now playing now. And of course, the Biden administration has is not prepared to shift on Israel or Ukraine, because they're basically saying they don't really want to completely seal off the border, because they know that would play badly again with some of their own voters. And they know that those voters probably in the end care more about the border, the immigrant flows and all that, than they do about Ukraine, to be frank. And they also probably know that some of their voters aren't particularly keen on Israel anyway. And besides, by refusing to go along with the vote for Israel, the Biden people could say, look, it's the Republicans. They're not only holding up funding to sort out the border, they're making it impossible to resolve the problem of Israel as well, because they won't vote money for that great cause that they also need to vote money for, which is Ukraine. So I think it suits everybody's interests at the moment for this thing to fail, and so that they can each blame each other and position themselves better in the election. It gives you an insight in some ways into how fundamentally uninterested in the Ukraine issue the broader political class is. There are specific people in Washington who care about Ukraine an awful lot. I think the president is one, but the wider political class, their primary concern is the election and positioning themselves now for the election, so that they can be in the best position of advantage when the election comes.
And then this Zuluskni saga. So he agreed to be the ambassador to Britain. Is that so? Does that mean from now on we're going to see more terrorist like a kind of attack now inside Russia? They're going to destroy, doing things to hurt, to destroy the civilian infrastructure to create some kind of panic without,
Yeah.
within Russia. Is that the next stage now?
Yes, I think it is, but I think it's important to say that for the moment that the report came out that Zuluskni was going to become ambassador to Britain, a short while later, in his office said that he never agreed to any such thing, and that he wanted to remain where he was. So this incredible, protracted saga continues unresolved. I mean, Zelensky versus Zuluskni, Zuluskni versus Zelensky, each pointing fingers at the other and blaming the other. And for the moment, at least, we don't have a resolution of this. But the longer term plan, and it's the Ukrainian plan, but it's also the plan of some people in the United States, is that they can now see that Ukraine is losing the war. And it's not going to be able to turn this thing round. It's another reason, by the way, why the Republicans are less interested in supporting Ukraine, because they understand that this war is lost. So they say, why ultimately should we bother? So they're not going to support Ukraine in the same way that they did before. The weapons aren't there, the money isn't there. Ukraine is losing. But that doesn't mean they're giving up on the project. So the idea now is to start some kind of great insurgency against the Russians, tie the Russians down. That's the idea. Drain them of resources, exhaust them in Ukraine as they struggle against this tremendous insurgency that they imagine that they're going to create in Ukraine. And that will leave the United States with its hands free to deal with China. And I've actually seen people in the United States talk in this way. Now, it is a terrible plan. First of all, you're absolutely right. It means the United States once more, not the first time, is indulging itself in terrorism. It's actually supporting terrorism, terrorists, and terroristic activity in another country. Another country, by the way, which is a nuclear power. Let's never forget that. But I mean, first of all, it is a disastrous idea for Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has already been destroyed. And now, on top of this terrible war, which comes on top of decades of economic crisis and political instability, it's going to have an insurgency thrust upon it. And secondly, I'm not, it's inherently destabilizing for Europe, which is presumably going to have to be the base area housing all these terrorists so that they can be sent into Ukraine and where they're going to be trained, get their weapons and all that kind of thing. And lastly, it's probably not going to work, because the idea that you can win a terrorist campaign against Russia, anybody who knows Russia knows that that isn't going to happen. I mean, the country, first of all, is enormous. If you plant a bomb in one Russian city, other Russian cities are a continent away. They're completely unaffected. What it will do is harden Russian opinion, make them even more sure that the West is their enemy, make them value their friendship with China even more. And can I just say, the Russian and the Chinese defense ministers had a virtual meeting the other day. And I don't know whether this was picked up in China, but it's buzzing all over Russia that the Russian defense minister referred to the new Chinese defense minister. He called him comrade. Okay, very unusual. I think unprecedented. So it's going to strengthen the relationship between Russia and China, and in the end, the Russians will win because I don't think there will be the support within Ukraine for this sort of thing. And if any one country has experience dealing with terrorisms and insurgencies, it is Russia. They defeated one in the Northern Caucasus, they defeated another in Syria. I'm pretty sure they'll be able to do the same in Ukraine.
I have to say, sometimes I wonder those people who are giving unconditional support, right, to Russia, to Ukraine. I mean, what kind of unconditional support? Look at Ukraine today, right? They lost 400, 500,000 of young men and women. And I mean, Ukraine's so much better to avoid this whole thing, right? Better off, and they lost the territory, they lose people, and their economy is, I don't know, I don't feel that it's doing well. And in the name of unconditional support. I mean, are these people, the unconditional support people, are they really stupid, or they just downright evil?
Well, I'm afraid I think it's the second, actually. And I'll be straightforward about this. I mean, I read an article the other day in the London Times. This is the London Times, mind you. And it talks about the demographic collapse of Ukraine, that no babies are being born there, that the average life expectancy of a Ukrainian man is now 57, which is one of the lowest in the world, that millions of people are leaving Ukraine, that its population, which was 51 million when the country gained its independence of the Soviet Union, has now fallen to 25 million. I mean, it is a terrible situation. And this has been the product of all this American Western unconditional support for Ukraine. I don't think the people who say these things really believe. I mean, some people do, but the policymakers, the people who make the decisions, I don't think they really are thinking about Ukraine at all. I think that for them, always the overriding thing is Russia. They want to weaken Russia. After all, that was what Lloyd Austin said. They want to weaken Russia. They want to sever Russian connections to Europe. They want to do all of these things. And Ukraine is being sacrificed in that cause.
And actually, to a certain degree, I think even like the same thing with Israel. I don't think Israel is in very good condition right now. I mean, there are also 500,000 Israelis, I read somewhere, left since October 7th. Meaning, if they don't, meaning if they feel this country has a great, bright future, why would they leave, right? They don't have much confidence. And of course, they're angered all their Arab neighbors, right? And I think their biggest diplomatic asset is the sympathy people around the world has towards the Jews after World War II. This is pretty much gone, all that sympathy. Why is that a good thing for Israel? So this unconditional support is not really in the long run helping Israel, the state Israel.
You are completely correct, and you're not the only person who makes that point. I mean, people like Professor John Mearsheimer at Chicago University is making this point for years. He says unconditional support for Israel has proved to be a disaster for Israel, and we've seen all that come to fruition now since the 7th of October. If Israel had taken a different course after the events of 7th October, if instead of launching an operation in Gaza with the encouragement of the United States, which gave them, as I said, a blank check to do it, if they'd gone instead to the United Nations, if they'd gone to the Security Council and said to the Security Council, we have been the subject of this violent attack, and asked the Security Council, in other words, the global community, for assistance, they would have got it. they'd have got it. They'd have got the sympathy of the world and the support of the world. Quite plausibly, Hamas would eventually have been a prescribed organization. It would have been recognized as a terrorist organization. We would have had its accounts frozen around the world. It would have had its people tracked down. Eventually, things would have turned out better for Israel. But no, they didn't do that. They didn't want to go to the United Nations. The United States didn't encourage them to do that. So far as I know, no one even discussed the possibility. And that's why Israel is in this terrible state. And I agree with you. And you're absolutely correct. It's very bad for the people of Israel. It's also very bad for Jewish people around the world. I know an awful lot of them who have invested emotionally very heavily in Israel's success. And they're becoming very despondent and very frightened.
This I saw somebody post on X a picture of Victoria Nuland, and they said if you see this woman in your country, after she leaves, there's going to be a civil war or something.
It's true. Yeah. Yeah.
So the unconditional support, be very careful.
Again, I mean, you would never see China do that.
Yeah.
I mean, the China would never do a thing like that. I mean, it would never come along to a country like, that found itself in the situation that Israel was in, and give it unconditional support.
Support.
They would give it support. They would give it advice.
The last question related to all this is Nobel Peace Prize. I think I just read an article. The committee, the secretary, the former Nobel Peace Prize committee secretary, his name is Geir Ludstad. So he kind of like regrets the Peace Prize given to Obama, because he's saying that at the time the goal is to support, to kind of encourage Obama to do the right thing, but clearly it failed, something like that. Okay, but first of all, I think they can take it back. They should. And then, of course, that's last year, 2023. Instead of giving it to this huge deal between Saudi and Iran, this rapprochement, they give to an Iranian dissident, a woman. I mean, do you feel like I feel like the Nobel Peace Prize is now lose credibility, is pretty much irrelevant now. Do you agree?
Is completely irrelevant. I mean, it has been for a very long time. I'm sorry to say this, but after the Cold War, the Nobel Prize Committee, not just, by the way, the Peace Prize part of it, but the whole thing basically got captured by the Western powers. I mean, the first exposure of this happened in the 1950s. It's an incident which perhaps people in China aren't familiar with, but it's the Dr. Zhivago Boris Pasternak affair. So Boris Pasternak was a Soviet writer, and he wrote a book called Dr. Zhivago, which, if you read it, is very far from being anti-Soviet, by the way. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, it was an attempt to describe the situation in the Soviet Union in the first during the revolution. In my opinion, not a very successful book, by the way. But anyway,
it turned into a movie. Is that right?
Yeah, it's turned into a movie. That the movie's much better than the film, by the way.
Yeah.
Than the book. But that's another than the book. But anyway, so he had to go through a process in the Soviet Union of having it checked domestically by the censors before it was published. Eventually, it would have been published, but an Italian, a communist Italian publisher, got his hands on the manuscript. The CIA stole it from the publisher and arranged for its publication in the West, and then leaned on the Nobel Prize Committee to give him a Nobel Prize. So, in effect, that meant that Pasternak found that his book had been published, circumventing the censorship, and he got himself into a tremendous trouble. But the point was that, again, that showed. I mean, by the way, that was unprecedented. I mean, people did not up to that point get literature prizes so quickly, immediately after the publication of a book.
Of one book.
So, I
Yeah.
mean, absolutely. So, I mean, usually you have to do decades
Yeah.
of writing before
Hmm.
you finally get to the point where you're entitled to
Yeah.
literature prize. So, I think that even as far back as then showed the extent to which the Nobel Prize Committee had been captured by the United States. And if you look at science prizes, I mean, the number of prizes that go to American scientists is so much greater than to everyone else that again, I mean, the United States has made huge contributions in the world of science, but it's not as lopsided as this implies.
Hmm.
And of course, increasingly, the Peace Prize has simply become a straightforward instrument of US diplomacy and foreign policy. So they give peace prizes to dissidents in Iran and dissidents in China and formerly dissidents in the former Soviet Union. No doubt Navalny will get his peace prize before long. I mean, in Russia, and all of these people get their peace prizes. But I think it's, and of course, Obama
Hmm.
got his Peace Prize, not because of anything he had done,
Done.
but because of what somebody in the Peace Prize committee said he hoped Obama might eventually do. I mean, how ridiculous is that? I mean, why not give Xi Jinping,
Yeah.
when he is elected president, why not give him a Peace Prize in that case to encourage him to do good things? I mean, it's absurd thinking. It
Mhm.
completely violates the ideas that existed when these peace prizes were first created. And by the way, the Nobel Peace Prize, it's important to say, was not created, as I understand it, by Alfred Nobel. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm not sure, but anyway. But put all that aside.
Uh-huh.
It's an absurd thing. It is completely ridiculous. And the important thing to understand is it is meaningless now. It is based on capture by the United States. And of course, one shouldn't take it seriously. I'm going to take that back. It was the economics, the
Economy.
Nobel Economics
Yeah.
Prize, which
Economy
is not
price.
set up by Alfred Nobel. All
Yeah.
the others were. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the economy price is actually the Swedish one is very clear. I don't know why it's translated into English, become Nobel Prize in economics, but the
Economics.
Swedish one is
Yes.
the Riksbank, which is the Swedish central bank prize
Well,
in
well, there
memory
you go.
of Alfred Nobel. Yeah, that
Well,
I
there you
mean,
go.
why do they translate English that way? But anyway, but you're right. I think the the economy prize is always it's another also a very strange prize. The people who work.
They're exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. I mean, well, if we're talking about the economics prize, which
yeah,
country has achieved the best results in economics over the last 30 years?
yeah,
How
yeah.
many Chinese economists have been
Mhm.
awarded by the Riksbank the Nobel Economics Prize? Can you name one? Can you think of one single Chinese economist who gets
Yeah.
awarded? Are there no economists in China?
Yeah, and in China, actually, even like you said, some long time ago, that people started saying, okay, if you want to win the Nobel Peace Prize, become a dissident, to a country
Yeah.
that U.S. doesn't like, then you will get the Peace Prize. Yeah, yeah,
Yes. Yes.
yeah. But
I
it's interesting that the former committee chair, he himself admitted that okay, the prize to Obama is not really, serve the purpose that they intended. Well, then my suggestion is take it back. Why don't you
will
take it
take
back?
it back. Well, absolutely take. Of course, they will. They will. They will never do that. They would never, ever, ever dream of doing such a thing. But well, I think the important thing to say is that these organizations have been captured by the United States,
Mhm.
but willingly so.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
people who sit on these committees fundamentally see the United States in the way that the United States wants to see them.
Mm.
So the structural bias that exists there is not something the Americans have imposed on these committees.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
something
yeah, I agree.
that
Yeah.
the committees are very open to themselves.
Yeah.
Frankly, the rest of the world should pay no attention. I
Mhm.
mean, it's the days when the Nobel Prize ever meant anything long since gone, in my opinion. In every field, literature, science,
Mhm.
economics, literature. I mean, does China produce no literature? I mean,
Yeah, yeah. China should have received a long time ago with Lu Xun. There's a whole bunch of people that could have
well, of course, exactly.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
precisely so. Yeah, but as I said, I mean, the idea of I mean, in place of utterly unknown Belarusian writers. I mean, I can't even remember her name now. Nobody ever reads. But to suggest that is just to know that it can't happen. And the moment you think that, you realize that, you also know that this committee, this prize, is really worthless.
And I agree with you that they willingly being captured. I do
Yeah.
think it's not like it's somebody forced anything upon them. And even my mom, when Obama got that prize, my mom even said something like, who never pay attention to these kind of geopolitical things, and she just, well, they are just bootlicker. They bootlick the U.S. That's what the Norwegians are doing. That my mom even can see that through. She used the
Yeah.
word bootlick. So
Well,
yeah,
there you go. Perceptive lady, but of course it's true.
yeah. All right, great. So let's do it. Continue next Wednesday. There's so many things going on. So thank you so
Yeah, yeah.
much. Yeah.
Indeed. And we can do it. We can indeed, and we can do it at our regular time.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good.
Okay.
Happy Chinese New
Thank you
Year.
very much. Thank you. Thank you. Happy Chinese Year to you
New
again.
Year. Okay.
Sophie.
Bye.